The crackling of the campfire filled the air as I sat cross-legged on a log, staring into the flames. The night was alive with the sounds of the wilderness, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. Around me, a group of wide-eyed scouts sat in a semicircle, their faces illuminated by the firelight. They had begged me to tell them a scary story, and after some hesitation, I agreed. But this wasn't going to be a fictional tale spun from imagination. No, this was a story rooted in my own memories, a chilling experience that still sent shivers down my spine whenever I thought about it. "Alright," I began, leaning forward slightly. "But I'll warn you, this isn't just a story. This actually happened to me when I was a scout leader, and it's something I'll never forget." The kids exchanged excited glances, their anticipation palpable. I took a deep breath and began. Story 1: Carry Encounter at a Scout Campsite. It was the summer of 2015, and I had recently returned to my hometown in rural Australia after years of living abroad. I had been a scout in my youth, and those years had shaped me in ways I couldn't fully articulate. The camaraderie, the adventures, the lessons learned under the open sky, it was a part of who I was. So, when I heard that my old scout troop was looking for adult leaders to help with a weekend camping trip, I didn't hesitate to volunteer. The campsite was one I knew well. Nestled in a dense forest about 30 minutes outside the city, it was a place I had visited countless times as a teenager. It was the kind of place that felt timeless, a patch of wilderness untouched by the modern world. The towering eucalyptus trees, the babbling creek, the rocky outcrops that offered stunning views of the valley below, it was a scout's paradise. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the fact that I was no longer a carefree teenager but an adult responsible for a group of kids. Or maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer as the sun dipped below the horizon. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip would be unlike any other. Setting. The first 2 days passed without incident. The scouts were in high spirits, their laughter echoing through the forest as they worked on their camping skills. We hiked, cooked over open fires, and even held a friendly competition to see who could build the best shelter. By nightfall, everyone was exhausted but happy, and the campsite was filled with the sounds of contented chatter and the occasional burst of giggles from the kids' tents. I shared a tent with 2 other leaders, Olivia and Jess. Olivia was a no-nonsense kind of woman in her late 30s, with a sharp wit and a knack for keeping the kids in line. Jess, on the other hand, was in her early 20s and had a bubbly personality that made her a favorite among the scouts. The 3 of us got along well, and I was grateful for their company. The campsite itself was relatively small, with a central clearing for the campfire and a ring of tents around the perimeter. Beyond the clearing, the forest loomed dark and dense, its secrets hidden beneath a canopy of leaves. At night, the only light came from the fire and the occasional flashlight beam as someone made their way to the portable toilet. The incident. It was on the 3rd night that everything changed. I had just fallen into a restless sleep when I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was one of the scouts getting up to use the bathroom, but as I lay there, listening, I realized something was off. The footsteps were too deliberate, too rhythmic. They weren't the hurried, stumbling steps of a half-asleep kid. No, these footsteps were slow and methodical, as if someone, or something, was circling our tent. My heart began to race as I strained to hear more. The footsteps stopped just outside our tent, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, they started again, moving in a slow, deliberate circle around us. I could feel the weight of each step, the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? A prank? Or something else entirely? I glanced over at Olivia and Jess, who were both awake now, their eyes wide with fear. Jess mouthed the words, "What is that?" but I could only shake my head in response. None of us dared to speak, afraid that whatever was outside might hear us. The footsteps stopped again, this time directly outside the tent flap. My breath caught in my throat as I waited, every muscle in my body tense. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, and then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. We waited for what felt like hours before any of us dared to move. Finally, Olivia whispered, "We need to check it out." I nodded, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay put. Grabbing a flashlight, I unzipped the tent flap and peered outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty clearing. There was no one there, no animal, no prankster, nothing. Just the eerie stillness of the forest. We searched the area, our flashlights sweeping across the ground, but there were no footprints, no signs of disturbance. It was as if the footsteps had never existed. But we had all heard them. We had all felt the presence of something just outside our tent. Aftermath. The next morning, we reported the incident to the other leaders, but they dismissed it as the work of an animal, a possum or a kangaroo, perhaps. But I knew better. I had spent enough time in the bush to know what animal sounded like, and this was no animal. The footsteps had been too deliberate, too human. The rest of the trip passed without incident, but the unease lingered. The kids seemed oblivious, their spirits undampened by the strange occurrence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been watched, that something had been testing us, probing our defenses. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened that night. Was it a ghost? A figment of our collective imagination? Or something else entirely? I don't know. What I do know is that the forest holds secrets, and sometimes, those secrets don't stay hidden. Conclusion. As I finished my story, the scouts sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. The fire had died down to embers, casting long shadows across the clearing. For a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the dying fire. "Do you think it was a ghost?" one of the kids finally asked, breaking the silence. I smiled faintly. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I do know this, the wilderness is full of mysteries, and sometimes, it's best to leave them unsolved." The kids nodded, their imaginations undoubtedly running wild. As we packed up for the night and headed to our tents, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder at the dark forest. The footsteps may have been years ago, but the memory was as vivid as ever. And as I zipped up my tent and settled in for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still out there, watching. This story is based on the outline you provided, expanded with descriptive details, character development, and atmospheric elements to create a compelling narrative. Let me know if you'd like to adjust or add anything. Story 2: Strange Phenomenon in Kettle Moraine State Forest. The forest was alive with the sounds of autumn. Leaves crunched underfoot as my friends and I made our way along the Ice Age Trail, a winding path that cut through the heart of Kettle Moraine State Forest in southeast Wisconsin. It was September 2017, and the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and decaying leaves. The sunlight filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. It was the perfect day for a hike, or so we thought. I was with two of my closest friends, Mark and Sarah. Mark was the kind of guy who could make anyone laugh, even in the most mundane situations. He had a knack for turning the ordinary into the extraordinary, and his enthusiasm was contagious. Sarah, on the other hand, was more reserved. She was the thinker of the group, always analyzing and questioning everything. Together, we made a balanced trio, and our camping trips were always filled with laughter, deep conversations, and the occasional adventure. But this trip would be different. This trip would challenge everything we thought we knew about the world. Setting: Kettle Moraine State Forest was a place of rugged beauty. The Ice Age Trail, a 1,000-mile footpath that traced the remnants of glaciers from millennia ago, was one of our favorite spots to hike. The trail was well marked but remote, winding through dense forests, rolling hills, and glacial kettles, deep depressions left behind by melting ice. It was the kind of place where you could lose yourself in nature, where the modern world felt like a distant memory. We had set up camp the night before in a small clearing near the trail. The campsite was primitive, with no running water or electricity, but that was part of the appeal. We spent the evening around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The night was clear, the sky filled with stars, and we fell asleep to the soothing sounds of the forest. The next morning, we packed our gear and set out on the trail. The plan was to hike a 10-mile loop, stopping for lunch at a scenic overlook before returning to camp. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with a gentle breeze that kept us comfortable as we walked. The incident. It was around midday when we noticed something strange. We had been hiking for a couple of hours, chatting and enjoying the scenery, when Mark suddenly stopped in his tracks. "Do you guys see that?" he asked, pointing ahead. I followed his gaze and froze. About 20 feet in front of us, the air seemed to shimmer, like heat rising off asphalt on a hot summer day. But this was different. The shimmering wasn't just a distortion, it was a distinct, rippling patch of air, about the size of a doorway. It hung in the middle of the trail, completely out of place. "What the hell is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice tinged with both curiosity and unease. We approached cautiously, our footsteps slowing as we drew closer. The shimmering grew more pronounced, the air within the patch appearing to ripple like water. It was as if someone had taken a piece of reality and stretched it, creating a portal to another world. "Do you think it's some kind of optical illusion?" Mark asked, though he didn't sound convinced. "I don't know," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. "But it's definitely there." We stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the phenomenon. None of us knew what to do. Should we turn back? Go around it? Or step through it? Finally, Mark broke the silence. "Well, we can't just stand here all day. Let's see what happens." Before anyone could stop him, he stepped forward and passed through the shimmering patch. For a moment, he disappeared from view, his form distorted by the rippling air. Then, just as quickly, he reappeared on the other side, completely unharmed. "See? Nothing to worry about," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. Sarah and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Your turn," she said, nudging me forward. Taking a deep breath, I stepped through the patch. The sensation was indescribable, like walking through a wall of static electricity, but without the shock. For a brief moment, the world around me seemed to blur, the colors and shapes melting together. Then, just as quickly, everything returned to normal. Sarah followed, her expression a mix of relief and confusion when she emerged on the other side. "That was weird," she said, glancing back at the shimmering patch. "But I guess it's harmless." We continued down the trail, the strange phenomenon quickly becoming the topic of conversation. Mark joked that we had stepped into another universe, while Sarah speculated that it might have been some kind of atmospheric anomaly. I didn't know what to think, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Aftermath. The rest of the hike passed without incident, but the memory of the shimmering patch lingered in the back of our minds. That evening, as we sat around the campfire, we couldn't help but revisit the topic. "Do you think it was some kind of glitch in the Matrix?" Mark asked, half joking. "Maybe," Sarah replied, her tone more serious than usual. "Or maybe it was something we're not meant to understand." I didn't say much, content to listen as they debated the possibilities. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I noticed a change in Sarah. She became more withdrawn, less willing to talk about the incident. Whenever Mark or I brought it up, she would quickly change the subject or brush it off as nothing. "It was probably just a trick of the light," she said one evening, her voice firm. "Let's just forget about it." But I couldn't forget. The memory of the shimmering patch haunted me, popping up in my dreams and lingering in the corners of my mind. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it had been nothing more than an optical illusion. But deep down, I knew better. Something had happened that day, something we couldn't explain. Conclusion. Years have passed since that trip, but the memory of the shimmering patch remains as vivid as ever. Mark and I still talk about it occasionally, though Sarah refuses to join the conversation. She insists that it was nothing, but I can't help but wonder if she's hiding something, if she saw or felt something that day that she's too afraid to share. As for me, I've come to accept that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. The forest is full of secrets, and sometimes, those secrets are best left undisturbed. But every now and then, when I'm hiking alone on a quiet trail, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shimmering patch of air once more. And if I ever do, I'm not sure what I'll do. Will I step through it again? Or will I turn and run, leaving the mystery behind? I don't know. But one thing is certain, the world is a stranger place than we realize, and sometimes, the line between reality and the unknown is thinner than we think. Story 3: The Tall Dark Figure on Sunset Beach. The sound of crashing waves filled the air as I stood on the porch of the beach house, staring out at the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the water. The beach was nearly empty, save for a few scattered shells and the occasional seagull. It was the perfect setting for a relaxing getaway, or so I thought. I was in Sunset Beach, North Carolina, with two of my closest friends, Alex and Brett. We had rented a small beach house for the weekend, eager to escape the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Alex was the kind of person who always had a story to tell, usually something eerie or unexplained. Brett, on the other hand, was a skeptic, always quick to dismiss anything that couldn't be explained by science. As for me, I fell somewhere in between, open-minded but cautious. Little did I know, this trip would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world. Background. Sunset Beach was a quiet, picturesque town known for its pristine shoreline and laid-back atmosphere. The beach itself was wide and flat, with sand that seemed to stretch on forever. At low tide, the water receded to reveal vast sand flats, creating a surreal landscape that felt almost otherworldly. We had arrived the day before, spending the evening unpacking and settling into the beach house. The first night was uneventful, filled with laughter, good food, and the occasional game of cards. But as the sun set and the sky turned a deep shade of orange, Alex brought up something that would change the tone of the trip. "You guys ever hear about the tall dark figure?" he asked, his voice low and serious. Brett rolled his eyes. "Here we go again. Another one of your ghost stories?" Alex ignored the jab and leaned forward, his expression uncharacteristically solemn. "I'm serious. People around here talk about it. They say that at low tide, when the sand flats are exposed, you can see this thing. It's tall, like way taller than a person, and completely black. No face, no features, just a shadowy figure standing out on the flats." I felt a chill run down my spine, though I tried to brush it off. "Sounds like a local legend," I said, though my voice wavered slightly. Alex shook his head. "It's not just a legend. My cousin swears he saw it a few years ago. He said it just stood there, watching him, before disappearing into thin air." Brett laughed, clearly unconvinced. "Yeah, sure. And I bet it was Bigfoot's cousin, right?" Alex didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the horizon. For a moment, the only sound was the rhythmic crashing of the waves. The incident. The next day, we decided to spend the afternoon exploring the beach. The tide was out, revealing the vast sand flats that Alex had mentioned the night before. The flats were eerily beautiful, their smooth surface reflecting the sunlight like a mirror. It was easy to see why people might believe in strange occurrences here, the place had an otherworldly quality to it. As we walked, Alex brought up the tall dark figure again. "Just, be careful, okay?" he said, his tone more serious than usual. "If you see something weird, don't go near it." Brett scoffed. "Relax, Alex. It's probably just some guy in a wetsuit or something." I didn't say anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. There was something about the way Alex had described the figure, the way it just stood there, watching, that sent a shiver down my spine. We continued walking, the sand crunching under our feet. The beach was deserted, the only sound the distant cry of seagulls. As we reached the edge of the sand flats, Brett suddenly stopped and pointed. "What's that?" I followed his gaze and froze. In the distance, maybe 100 yards away, was a tall, dark figure. It was impossibly tall, at least 8 or 9 feet, and completely black, as if it had been cut out of the fabric of reality. It stood perfectly still, its featureless form silhouetted against the horizon. My heart began to race as I stared at the figure, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't look human, its proportions were all wrong, its limbs too long and thin. And yet, there was something undeniably alive about it. "What the hell is that?" Brett whispered, his voice trembling. Alex didn't respond, his face pale as he stared at the figure. For a moment, none of us moved, our eyes locked on the strange entity. Then, as if sensing our presence, the figure turned its head, or at least, the part of its body where a head should have been, and looked directly at us. That was all it took. Without a word, we turned and ran, our feet slipping on the wet sand as we sprinted back toward the beach house. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel the figure's gaze on me, burning into my back like a brand. Aftermath. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of the beach house. Once inside, we locked the doors and drew the curtains, as if that would somehow protect us from whatever we had seen. For a long time, none of us spoke, the only sound our ragged breathing. Finally, Brett broke the silence. What was that?" Alex shook his head, his face still pale. "I told you. The tall dark figure." I didn't say anything, my mind racing as I tried to process what had happened. The figure had been so real, so tangible, and yet it defied all logic. What was it? A hallucination? A trick of the light? Or something else entirely? We spent the rest of the day in a daze, jumping at every sound and glancing nervously out the windows. That night, none of us slept well, our dreams filled with shadowy figures and endless sand flats. The next morning, we packed up and left Sunset Beach, eager to put the experience behind us. But even as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had encountered something beyond our understanding. Closing remarks. Years have passed since that trip, but the memory of the tall dark figure remains as vivid as ever. Brett refuses to talk about it, dismissing it as a trick of the light or a figment of our imagination. Alex, on the other hand, remains convinced that we saw something otherworldly. As for me, I'm still not sure what to believe. The rational part of me wants to dismiss it as a hallucination or a shared delusion. But deep down, I know that what we saw was real. The figure was there, standing on the sand flats, watching us with its featureless face. The world is full of mysteries, and sometimes, those mysteries defy explanation. The tall dark figure is one of those mysteries, a reminder that there are things in this world that we may never understand. So, what do you think? Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this one. As the screen fades to black, eerie music plays, leaving viewers with a lingering sense of unease.